What if I told you that an entire world vanished in just one short summer? In 1883, an unusual silence fell over the Great Plains, forever altering the fate of the Lakota people. For centuries, their culture, way of life, and very survival had been inextricably linked to the vast herds that covered the land to the horizon. This time, however, the well-prepared and fully equipped camp was met with the terrifying emptiness of the endless prairie. Imagine the shock experienced by the proud warriors and their families when they realized that the source of their livelihood, clothing, and shelter had been wiped from the face of the earth. This was not merely the end of their customary hunt, but a true collapse of their entire worldview, which was built on harmony with nature. How exactly did this people face such a massive catastrophe? And why was no one able to prevent the rapid destruction of their very foundation? Watch the video to the end and you'll learn how the hunters' final hunt unfolded, returning in complete silence under the weight of the loss of an entire era, and what consequences this had for the entire continent. In the meantime, get comfortable, like this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new exciting historical investigations. Are you ready to learn the truth about the quietest dawn in the history of the Wild West? The sun had barely illuminated the hilltops when the familiar, measured preparations began in the Lakota camp. The men silently checked their gear, carefully inspecting every element of their ancestors' centuries-old legacy. The wooden spear shafts were checked for perfect straightness, and the bowstrings were drawn with their usual care. At this hour, the air was thick with fog, obscuring the outlines of distant mountains and lowlands. Tradition demanded special attention to detail on every sortie onto the plains. Arrowheads were securely fastened with strong sinews, dried under the hot summer sun. Every movement of the men had been perfected through years of training and passed down from the older generation to the younger. They covered their faces with special pigments made from ground clay and natural plant juices. These patterns carried deep meaning, signifying their affiliation with a particular clan and protecting them from the scorching rays. A typical morning of preparations was always accompanied by anticipation of the long journey and hope for a bountiful catch. However, in the summer of 1883, an inexplicable unease hung over the camp. The wind carried only the dry scent of scorched grass, foreshadowing no changes in the familiar landscape. The women carefully packed provisions into sturdy leather bags, trying not to make any unnecessary noise. The meager supplies of dried meat and berries were intended to sustain them during the long journey. The leather saddles were carefully wiped down and inspected for even the slightest scuffs or damage. The men cared for their mounts just as attentively as they did for their own weapons. The straps, made of sturdy rawhide, were tightened securely, ensuring the rider remained firmly in place during a fast gallop. People's gazes increasingly turned toward the distance, where dark moving spots were usually visible. Today, the horizon remained completely clear, merging with the pale blue sky without a single cloud. Preparations were drawing to a close as the sun finally rose over the endless expanses of the plains. The morning mist had dissipated, revealing the sun-scorched earth dotted with sparse patches of dry vegetation. The men began to gather in small groups, assigning tasks for the day ahead. The absence of the usual bustle and lively chatter made this moment incredibly solemn and at the same time daunting. A deep understanding of nature told them that this expedition would be unlike any before. Experienced trackers carefully studied the direction of the wind and the dryness of the steppe grass beneath their feet. This knowledge helped them navigate the vast expanses and find the right path to their destination. They were accustomed to reading the prairie like an open book, noticing the slightest changes in their surroundings. Today, this book seemed empty, devoid of the familiar signs and landmarks that guided their movement. Nevertheless, their duty to the tribe compelled them to move forward, despite their growing doubts. The final preparations were completed in an atmosphere of absolute concentration and deep respect for tradition. The people slowly made their way to the edges of the camp, leaving behind the smoldering embers of the morning fires. The warm summer breeze ruffled the hems of their leather garments, as if trying to halt their advance. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of unexplored emptiness, concealing the answers to their unspoken questions. This departure marked the beginning of the most important and most difficult trial in their history. Concluding this silent ritual, the hunters lined up in a straight row at the edge of their settlement. They stood motionless, gazing into the endless distance where the sky merged with the scorched earth. We'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about these moments of absolute silence before a great trial? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps us create deeper and more meaningful historical reenactments for our community. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to continue this fascinating journey into the past with us. The hidden truth that everyone keeps silent is that emptiness can be louder than any sound. The Lakota detachment slowly left the camp, plunging into an endless sea of tall, dry grass. Usually, such a departure was accompanied by a sense of unity with nature and a joyful anticipation of the coming encounter. However, now every step echoed hollowly in the hearts of the men walking. They moved in even formation, keeping their distance and carefully surveying the surrounding landscape. The sun was rapidly rising toward its zenith, generously flooding the plain with its merciless summer light. The detachment pressed forward, leaving behind only a barely noticeable trail of trampled vegetation. Experienced leaders guided the way, using distant landmarks such as solitary rocks and hills for orientation. The ground beneath their feet was dry and hard, cracked from the long absence of rain. The wind carried fine dust that settled on the travelers' leather garments and faces. In times past, this path had been teeming with life and a multitude of diverse tracks. Trackers could easily distinguish hoof prints, broken shrub branches, and grass trampled down for a night's rest. Now, however, a completely pristine surface lay before their eyes, untouched by any significant movement. The absence of familiar landmarks forced them to expand their search area and change their routes. They made frequent stops, scanning the horizon and trying to catch the slightest signs of their target's presence. By midday, the party had covered a considerable distance, venturing deep into territories that had always been considered the richest. The men moved with remarkable endurance, complaining neither of fatigue nor of the scorching sun. Their bodies had been adapted to the harsh conditions of the Great Plains from a very early age. They knew how to conserve energy by taking measured steps and controlling their breathing. However, physical fatigue took a back seat to the weight of realizing the changes taking place around them. In these places, the earth had always held the memory of past seasons and great migrations. Deep ruts, carved by millions of hooves over many centuries, crisscrossed the plain. These ancient trails were clearly visible even through the thick thickets of weeds. Now they looked abandoned, like the beds of dried-up rivers that had lost their waters forever. The travelers walked along these trails as if along monuments to an era that had faded into oblivion. The shadows began to lengthen, heralding the imminent arrival of evening and its welcome coolness. The group chose a small hill to take a brief rest and assess the situation. From here, a wide view stretched for many miles around, allowing them to scan all possible directions. The scouts strained their eyes into the distance, hoping to spot a cloud of dust rising above the horizon. But the air remained completely clear, devoid of any signs of large-scale movement. During this stop, no one took out any food, as their hunger was dulled by a shared sense of disappointment. They merely took a few sips of warm water from their leather water bags. Silence continued to hang in the air, replacing any possible words of comfort or hope. Each was lost in their own thoughts, trying to find a rational explanation for this terrifying emptiness. The world they knew and understood was crumbling right before their eyes. The sunset painted the sky in crimson hues, marking the end of the first day of their fruitless search. They found not a single trace, not a single bent blade of grass indicating the presence of life. How do you think these people felt, realizing the scale of the catastrophe that had occurred? In the next chapter, you will learn what incredible methods of tracking these outstanding masters employed in their attempt to find even a single sign on the barren land. The secret, passed down from generation to generation, is hidden in the very breath of the earth. On the second day of the search, the Lakota applied their most secret and complex navigation skills. The art of the tracker lay not simply in searching for footprints on soft ground, but in a deep understanding of all natural processes. They analyzed the behavior of the wind, which could carry scents over vast distances. The slightest change in the direction of the air currents gave them valuable information about what lay beyond the horizon. Particular attention was paid to studying the vegetation across the endless expanses of the plains. Grass, flattened by heavy weight, regained its shape at a certain rate, depending on humidity and temperature. An experienced eye could determine the time that had elapsed since someone had passed through here with an accuracy of a few hours. They looked for stalks snapped at a certain height or leaves unnaturally turned with their light side facing up. Even the absence of morning dew in some areas could serve as an important guide. Elders with an incredible memory for weather anomalies of past years were consulted to analyze the situation. They compared the current drought with similar periods, trying to calculate possible migration routes. Their wisdom suggested that in such times the herd always moves closer to the foothills, where remnants of moisture remain. The party adjusted its route, heading toward the silhouettes of rocky ridges darkening in the distance. This trek required immense exertion as the terrain became increasingly rugged. Studying bodies of water, even dried up ones, was a complex science in itself. The mud along the shores of dried up lakes could preserve traces for many months, becoming a kind of archive of the past. The trackers carefully examined these hard crusts, trying to find fresh imprints over old cracks. They looked for changes in the texture of the silt, indicating a recent disturbance of its surface. But all they saw were smooth, sun-baked basins, devoid of any history. Sometimes they paid attention to the distribution of pollen from flowering grasses on the surface of flat stones. The passage of a massive object inevitably disturbed this delicate layer, leaving visible streaks or swirls. This method required absolute concentration and perfect vision, for which the hunters of the Great Plains were renowned. They examined the boulders lining the ancient trails, hoping to find this fleeting sign of presence. The pollen lay in an even, undisturbed layer, like yellow snow that had fallen in the middle of a hot summer. Reading invisible signs also involved analyzing the temperature of different areas of the surface. In the evening, as the earth began to cool, places that had recently been in the shadow of large objects retained a different temperature. By feeling the ground with their hands, experienced masters could sense these barely perceptible temperature variations. This skill seemed almost mystical, but was based on a profound understanding of the physical laws of nature. Unfortunately, even this unique method yielded no positive results in their desperate search. The difficulty of their work lay in the fact that they had to search for confirmation of absence, not presence. Usually, the traces led them forward, guiding and motivating them to continue along the route. Now, however, they had to draw information from the void itself, analyzing the causes of its emergence. This was incredibly difficult psychologically, as each new day robbed them of a shred of hope. The trackers' expertise proved powerless in the face of the global changes taking place on their native land. They pooled all their knowledge, applied the rarest and most complex methods of reading nature, but failed. The vast plain gave them not a single clue, remaining silent and empty. This fact became undeniable proof that the world they knew had vanished forever. If you enjoyed this story about the remarkable skill of reading nature, be sure to like this video. What would happen if no one learned of this alarming discovery in time? On the third day of their journey, the party emerged onto a wide plateau that offered a view for dozens of miles around. In the past, it was here that they had always found what they had set out to find on their long journeys. This place was considered sacred, symbolizing abundance and the eternal renewal of life on the plains. Now, however, a completely lifeless wasteland, scorched by the merciless sun, stretched out before their eyes. The wind swept across the endless expanse, encountering no obstacles in its path. It carried with it only dry dust and scraps of withered grass, rolling them across the ground. The space seemed so vast and empty that its sheer scale was literally overwhelming. The men stopped at the edge of the plateau, unable to believe their own eyes. The silence that hung around them was so thick that it rang in their ears with a heavy, metallic hum. The emptiness of the prairie was not merely a physical absence. It had become a tangible phenomenon, weighing down on their consciousness. It stripped their entire journey, their training, and their unique skills of all meaning. The hunters found themselves in the role of guardians, guarding an empty house from which its owners had departed forever. They scanned the horizon with the despair of people who had lost the most precious thing in their lives. This emptiness was absolute and all-encompassing, leaving no room for any illusions. The sun continued its relentless race across the sky, scorching the last traces of color from the parched earth. The hunters' shadows seemed unnaturally long and thin against this faded, bleached-out landscape. They walked in silence, for words had lost their power in the face of such a massive catastrophe. Each of them understood that this was not merely a bad season, but a final and irreversible end. The nature of the Great Plains had changed forever, leaving them alone to face a new, harsh reality. In the distance, the outline of a dry riverbed appeared, winding among the sandy hills. Usually, such places served as natural boundaries and important landmarks during long treks. They descended into the riverbed, hoping to find shade beneath the steep banks of compacted clay. The ground here was covered with deep cracks resembling a spider web stretching for miles. Even this ancient shelter now seemed inhospitable and abandoned, stripped of its saving coolness. They spent several hours in the riverbed, resting and waiting out the peak of the day's heat. No one discussed future plans, as every direction now seemed equally pointless. The elders sat with their eyes closed, lost in deep contemplation of their people's fate. The young warriors aimlessly sifted the dry sand through their fingers, letting it slip through their hands. It was a time of quiet realization of the loss that would forever change their familiar way of life. By evening, they climbed the plateau once more to take one last look at the vast emptiness stretching out before them. The setting sun bathed the dry grass in the color of old gold, creating an illusion of former grandeur. But this beauty was deceptive and cold, like the glint of frozen water on a winter lake. The plain bid them farewell, displaying its complete and unconditional solitude beneath the boundless sky. They set up camp right there, making no attempt to find a more sheltered place to spend the night. Night fell upon the land, covering the empty prairie with a dense blanket of millions of bright stars. The wind finally died down, allowing absolute silence to finally take hold of this vast expanse. Do you think it was possible to foresee such a sudden disappearance of an entire world? In the next chapter, you will learn how their evening at the camp unfolded, where silence became the only companion of these strong people. The organization of the camp that evening was radically different from their usual traditions and rules. The people did not build large bonfires, limiting themselves to tiny hearths in depressions in the dry ground. They did not set up proper shelters, simply spreading their leather cloaks directly on the hard grass. The absence of the usual bustle and conversation made this process mechanical and devoid of any meaning. Each member of the group performed their tasks automatically, deeply immersed in their own heavy thoughts. Dinner consisted of small portions of pre-prepared food, which they washed down with warm water. The meal took place in complete silence, interrupted only by the faint clinking of dishes. In the past, evenings by the fire had been filled with stories, plans, and discussions of upcoming actions. Now, however, there was nothing to share, as the future seemed foggy and extremely troubling to them. The silence of the camp felt physically palpable, like a thick fog enveloping everyone sitting by the fire. The elders, whose wisdom had always been the tribe's mainstay, seemed particularly lost that evening. Their experience held no answers to the challenges they had faced during that parched summer. Traditions and knowledge passed down for centuries suddenly proved inapplicable to the new, harsh reality. They understood that returning to the settlement empty-handed would be a crushing blow to everyone. Therefore, they remained silent, unable to utter the words confirming the inevitable end of their era. The young warriors, raised on tales of great campaigns, felt a deep sense of disappointment. Their strength and skill had proven unnecessary, depriving them of the chance to prove themselves and be of use. They gazed into the dark distance, trying to come to terms with the fact that their lives would never be the same again. The emptiness of the prairie had robbed them not only of their purpose, but also of a part of their very identity. That evening became a harsh lesson in humility for them in the face of insurmountable circumstances. Gradually, the campfires began to die down, leaving behind only small handfuls of gray ash. The cold night air forced the people to wrap themselves more tightly in their cloaks, preserving the warmth of their bodies. Despite their intense physical exhaustion, sleep was slow to come to the participants of this expedition. They lay on the hard ground, gazing at the starry sky and listening to the ringing silence. Each of them was undergoing an inner transformation, bidding farewell to the world they had irretrievably lost. The darkness concealed the boundless expanse, narrowing their world to the size of a small night camp. This temporary refuge seemed like a tiny island in the middle of a vast, hostile, and utterly empty ocean. The absence of a familiar purpose made their existence in this space meaningless and absurd. They felt like strangers on the land that had belonged to their ancestors for millennia and had sustained them. This alienation was the most painful revelation of this long and fruitless journey. As morning approached, the temperature dropped significantly, covering the dry grass with a thin layer of cold frost. The sky in the east began to slowly lighten, heralding the dawn of a new day of their arduous ordeal. Dawn brought no relief, but only illuminated once more the endless emptiness of the sun-scorched plain. The camp began to wake up as quietly and mechanically as it had fallen asleep the night before. No one was in a hurry to get ready for the road, since the direction of travel no longer mattered. They stood and watched as the first rays of the sun glided over the tips of the dry grass. This was the beginning of their return journey, a journey of acknowledging their defeat in the face of a new reality. The camp was quickly packed up, leaving no traces behind on the hard ground. They formed a column ready to begin the most arduous return journey in their long history. Silence continued to accompany them, becoming an inseparable companion on this sad and gloomy march. The secret that will transform the field of historical understanding lies right at our feet. On the way back, the team began to notice details of the landscape that had previously been overlooked in their haste. The plain was not simply empty, it was covered with deep, unnatural scars left by wheels. Wide ruts left by heavy wagons crossed their ancient trails at right angles. These deep gouges disrupted the natural terrain, creating obstacles where there had once been a smooth surface. The soil in these ruts had been compressed to the consistency of stone, preventing new chutes from breaking through. The wind blew the soft earth out of them, turning the wagon tracks into long, dusty ruts. For the Lakota, these changes were evidence of a crude intrusion into the harmony of their native land. They skirted these deep furrows with a sense of deep unease and growing bewilderment at what was happening. The landscape was changing at an alarming rate, erasing familiar landmarks and creating entirely new boundaries. Along these new paths, strange and alien objects discarded by travelers were encountered from time to time. Rusty pieces of metal, fragments of wooden wheels, and shards of glass stood out starkly against the natural backdrop. These artifacts bore witness to the presence of a completely different culture, with different values and goals. The hunters did not touch these things, perceiving them as signs of impending, large-scale disaster. Each such object was a silent messenger of a new era that was rapidly supplanting their world. The ground around the posts was trampled by people and horses, leaving deep indentations in the mud. These tracks were radically different from those they had grown accustomed to reading over the years. They spoke of a massive and purposeful advance by those who were building this vast web. The hunters studied the prints of shod hooves closely, trying to assess the scale of this invasion into their territory. The results of their observations left no doubt about the inevitability of the coming global changes. The landscape was changing not only because of the appearance of new structures, but also because of the destruction of the old ones. The groves of tall trees in the river valleys, which had served as shelter from the heat, had been completely cut down. In their place remained only rows of smooth stumps protruding from the cracked, parched earth. The wood had been used to build those very posts and to reinforce the wide transport routes. The disappearance of the trees altered the courses of streams, accelerating the drying up of entire regions that had once been fertile. The change in the landscape caused the winds to blow stronger, carrying more dust. The air often grew murky from rising sandstorms that obscured the sun for hours on end. This dust settled on everything around them, covering the grass, their clothes, and the faces of the weary travelers. The plain lost its vibrant colors, turning into a monotonous gray wasteland devoid of any signs of life. They walked through this dusty haze like ghosts wandering the ruins of their own home. Each new day brought them discoveries confirming the scale of the destruction of their familiar world. They saw dammed-up rivers, altered riverbeds, and depleted sources of what had once been clean drinking water. The land, which had always been generous to them, now looked sick and exhausted by constant interference. This sight evoked deep sorrow in the hearts of men accustomed to living in harmony with nature. They realized their utter helplessness in the face of these monumental and inevitable changes. The altered landscape served as a vivid demonstration of the end of an entire era that had lasted for many centuries. Will these plains ever return to their original state, or are the changes irreversible? In the next chapter, you will learn how their arduous journey back through these lands unfolded. The journey home had always been a time of joy, when the detachment returned with the fruits of its labor. Now, however, every step toward their home camp required an incredible mental effort. The men walked with their heads bowed, paying no attention to the scorching sun or the gusty steppe wind. The column stretched for hundreds of yards as no one bothered to keep the ranks tight. The silence that had accompanied them on their search had now become even heavier and unbearably oppressive. Returning empty-handed meant more than just failure in this particular expedition to the plains. It was a sign that the tribe would face incredible hardships in the coming winter. The lack of materials to repair their dwellings and clothing threatened the survival of their entire community. The men understood this responsibility, and the weight of that realization pressed down on their shoulders more heavily than fatigue. They moved forward only thanks to their iron will and a deep sense of duty to their families. The landscape around them remained as desolate and bleak as when they first saw it. The familiar hills and valleys no longer evoked a sense of recognition or the joy of returning home. The land seemed foreign, having lost the vitality that had bound them to it for centuries. They crossed dried-up riverbeds, not pausing to rest in the shade of the steep banks. Time lost its meaning, merging into one endless march under the scorching rays of the summer sun. Their supplies of food and water were running low, forcing the travelers to conserve every precious sip. They subsisted on meager scraps of dried meat, without lighting fires to cook proper meals. Physical exhaustion began to affect their pace and overall coordination. However, no one complained about the hardships, as their inner turmoil drowned out the physical pain. This endurance had been instilled in them by generations of ancestors who had survived in the harshest conditions. The elders, despite their age, continued to march alongside the young and strong warriors. Their faces were inscrutable, hiding their true feelings behind a mask of absolute calm and dignity. They served as an example of fortitude for the rest, not allowing despair to take hold of the squad members' minds. Wisdom told them that even greater trials lay ahead, requiring immense strength. The wind continued to erase their tracks, as if nature were trying to wipe out their very presence. They walked through the gray dust, transformed into silent shadows against the backdrop of the vast, scorched plain. This journey had become a symbol of their people's transition from an era of greatness to an era of oblivion. Everyone understood this, but no one dared to voice their thoughts even to their closest friends. A word spoken aloud would have made this catastrophe final and irreversible, robbing them of their last shreds of hope. By the end of the week, the familiar outlines of their native hills and valleys finally appeared on the horizon. Usually, this sight would have sparked joyful excitement, causing people to quicken their pace and talk loudly. Now, however, the sight of the camp in the distance elicited only a heavy sigh that rippled through the entire column. Returning to the settlement meant having to admit defeat in front of their wives and children. It was the most terrifying moment of the entire journey, requiring immense courage and inner strength. They stopped at the top of the hill to tidy their clothes and equipment before entering. The men brushed off the dust, adjusted their straps, and lined up in a straight row, maintaining a proud posture. Regardless of the outcome, they remained warriors of their people, bound to carry their burden with dignity. They began the slow descent into the valley, where the inhabitants of the settlement, worried by their prolonged absence, were already waiting for them. This descent marked the end of a long journey and the beginning of a new, unpredictable chapter in their history. The detachment's appearance at the top of the hill was immediately spotted by the sentries standing at the camp's borders. News of the men's return spread instantly through all the dwellings, sparking a wave of anxious anticipation. People emerged from their shelters, peering at the approaching figures against the backdrop of the faded summer sky. Usually they were greeted with joyful shouts, but today a thick, heavy silence hung over the settlement. No one saw the heavy loads that always accompanied the hunters' successful return from the Great Plains. The party descended slowly, maintaining perfect formation and the absolute silence characteristic only of the most solemn moments. Their faces, covered in a layer of gray dust, expressed unyielding determination and a deep sorrow hidden from all. They did not look around, fixing their gaze straight ahead, as if carrying an invisible, heavy banner. With each step they took, the tension in the camp grew, for everyone understood the true reason for this silence. Those who had come to meet them parted, forming a wide corridor for the returning men to pass through to the center of their settlement. The elders who had remained in the camp stepped forward to be the first to greet the arrivals and hear their story. They leaned on their staffs, carefully studying the empty hands and emaciated faces of the returning warriors. The gazes of these wise men expressed an understanding of the inevitability of what had happened on the vast prairie. They asked no questions, for the appearance of the detachment spoke louder than any words could describe the situation. This encounter became a silent admission of defeat for an entire culture in the face of insurmountable external circumstances. These brief phrases fell upon the listeners like heavy stones, finally shattering their familiar world. No one uttered a sound, for the shock of what they had heard was too strong and profound. The leader's words confirmed their worst fears, stripping them of any illusions or hopes for a favorable outcome. The people stood motionless, trying to grasp the scale of the catastrophe that had befallen their long-suffering, proud people. It was a moment of truth when they came face to face with the end of their great era. After a brief speech, the unit disbanded, and each man silently made his way to his home. They took off their heavy gear, stowing it in far corners as if hiding artifacts no longer needed. Weapons, prepared with such meticulous care, now seemed like a completely useless burden in this changed world. The process of disarming took place automatically, without the usual tending to the spear or bow. After a long march, they sat down on the ground, covering their eyes with their hands to hide their inner pain and confusion. The camp was plunged into a state of mourning, though there was no formal occasion for such rituals. The absence of their usual prey meant the loss not only of food, but also of the foundation of their cultural identity. Their entire way of life, from making clothes to building dwellings, depended on what the prairie provided. Now that foundation had been torn out by the roots, leaving them adrift in a void of uncertainty and fear. They had lost the bedrock upon which their people's history had been built for centuries. That evening, no songs rang out over the settlement, and no traditional ceremonies of thanksgiving to nature were held. The campfires burned dimly, illuminating only the small spaces around the people gathered in tight groups. The elders withdrew to hold a closed-door council, trying to find a way out of the critical situation that had arisen. Their experience offered no ready-made answers to challenges of this magnitude, requiring them to make entirely unconventional decisions. The tribe's future was under serious threat, demanding incredible flexibility and courage from them. Night fell on the camp, bringing with it a cold wind and a sense of absolute terrifying hopelessness. The people slept restlessly, often waking from anxious thoughts about what tomorrow would bring. This arrival became the dividing line separating their glorious past from a harsh and unpredictable new future. They fell asleep in one world and woke up in a completely different one, stripped of familiar landmarks and meaning. Thus ended the saddest and most pivotal day in the history of the proud people of the Great Plains. To understand the depth of this catastrophe, one must realize what this loss meant for the Lakota. It was not merely the loss of a source of sustenance. It was the collapse of an entire industry that sustained their lives. Every part of their customary catch had a strictly defined purpose and was used to its fullest potential. Sturdy hides were sewn into reliable shelters, capable of withstanding the harshest winter blizzards on the open plains. Warm winter clothing, protecting against the bitter cold, was also made from these dense and heavy materials. Tendons were turned into the strongest threads for sewing clothing and making durable bowstrings. Bones were used to create a variety of tools, from scrapers for processing hides to sewing needles. Horns were carved into convenient spoons, bowls, and various ritual objects for conducting important ceremonies. Even hooves found a use in creating the strong adhesive needed for making weapons. Virtually 100% of the materials were put to use, leaving no useless waste behind. The economic model of exchange that had existed between different tribes for generations also collapsed. Leather and bone products were the main currency they traded for goods from their neighbors. Without these resources, they found themselves cut off from their usual trade routes and deprived of the means to obtain what they needed. This exacerbated their isolation and made them even more vulnerable in the face of impending global changes. The tribe's economic independence was destroyed along with the source of their traditional prosperity. The elders understood that the loss of the foundation of their lives would lead to an inevitable transformation of society itself. Without the need for complex and coordinated collective actions, the tribe's social structure would begin to slowly disintegrate. Individualism and the struggle for scarce remaining resources might replace the familiar mutual aid and communal support. Preserving traditions under such conditions would become a virtually impossible task for future generations of indigenous people. This realization was the bitterest fruit they brought back with them from the empty prairie. The geography of their movements also had to change radically due to the new harsh conditions. They could no longer freely follow the source of life across the boundless expanses from the Missouri to the mountains. They had to seek out new, much more limited territories to ensure their bare survival. This meant giving up the freedom of movement that had been the core value of their nomadic culture for centuries. The land that had once belonged entirely to them was now shrinking to the size of tiny, isolated patches. The change in diet was bound to affect the physical health and endurance of the entire tribe. The transition to less nutritious and unfamiliar food sources would weaken their immunity and resistance to disease. This was particularly dangerous on the eve of winter, when the body required maximum energy and warmth. The elders looked at the young people with concern, realizing that they would have to endure the most severe trials. Preserving the nation's health became the primary and most difficult task for the community's leadership. The psychological trauma of losing their familiar way of life would leave a deep mark on people's hearts. A sense of hopelessness and loss of control over one's own destiny would paralyze the will and the ability to resist. They would have to relearn how to find meaning in a world that had become hostile to them. This internal struggle will be no less difficult than the struggle against hunger or the cold winter winds. Overcoming this crisis will require the consolidation of all the moral and spiritual strength of the remaining members of the tribe. The significance of this loss could not be overstated or measured by ordinary material or economic standards. It was the end of an entire civilization that had flourished for millennia across the vast expanses of North America. They stood on the threshold of a new era that held no promise of good things for them in the foreseeable future. Their lives were forever divided into before and after that fateful summer of 1883. The memory of this loss would be passed down from generation to generation, becoming the saddest chapter in their history. The autumn of 1883 brought with it the first cold winds and frosts. The camp was preparing for winter amid a severe shortage of all resources necessary for survival. People reinforced their old dwellings with whatever they could find in the vicinity of the dried-up riverbeds. Dry branches, earth, and scraps of old hides were used to insulate the thinning walls of their shelters. This process was filled with anxiety and the realization that these measures might not be enough. The elders held long councils discussing the inevitability of making new decisions that would be extremely difficult for a proud people. They understood that independent existence on the Great Plains had become physically impossible under the new conditions. The question of moving to the confined territories of reservations arose with all its terrifying, brutal urgency. This meant a complete renunciation of freedom and submission to rules imposed from outside by a foreign authority. The debates were heated, but the arguments of those in favor of submission rested on the undeniable fact of the threat of mass starvation. The decision to relocate was made not out of weakness, but for the sake of the physical survival of future generations. The tribal leaders took upon themselves the heaviest responsibility for this humiliating, yet only possible step toward salvation. They addressed the people with a speech explaining the necessity of adapting to a world that had changed beyond recognition. The people listened to them in somber silence, understanding all the bitterness and the truth of the heavy words they spoke. It was an act of the greatest humility before forces that surpassed their own capabilities and ancient knowledge. The process of packing up the camp began for the final, saddest migration in the history of their free people. They took only the bare necessities with them, leaving part of their past behind at their old encampments. Items that had lost their practical value were burned or buried in the ground with all the proper rituals. It was a farewell to an era when they were the rightful masters of these boundless steppe expanses. Tears on the women's faces and the men's grim silence accompanied every stage of this arduous journey. The journey to new frontiers followed the very same routes they had recently traveled on their return. Now these empty lands did not simply seem lifeless to them, they seemed forever lost. They passed deep ruts and wooden posts that had become symbols of their new confinement. This journey was steeped in a sense of bitterness and injustice they could not fight. They had been transformed from free hunters into exiles in their own historic homeland. Their arrival at the designated borders marked the beginning of a completely new and unfamiliar way of life. They would have to learn to farm on poor soil and depend on food supplies from outside. This dependence crushed their pride and destroyed centuries-old traditions of self-sufficiency and economic independence. The transition from an active nomadic life to a sedentary existence caused deep apathy among most men. Their energy and skills were no longer needed in this new, artificially created reality. Women had to learn to work with new materials for sewing clothes and preparing unfamiliar, foreign foods. Traditional crafts began to decline due to the lack of familiar, high-quality raw materials. Passing on knowledge to younger generations became difficult as old skills lost their practical significance. Culture was threatened with complete extinction under the onslaught of new, top-down rules of existence. Nevertheless, they tried with all their might to preserve at least fragments of their great heritage. Winter within the new borders proved to be incredibly harsh and brought with it many severe trials. The lack of warm clothing and quality food led to the spread of disease among the weakened population. The elders passed away one by one, taking with them the wisdom and memories of years gone by. This period became the darkest time in their history, testing the resilience of the entire people. They survived thanks to incredible patience and the inner strength instilled in them by generations of ancestors. Despite all the hardships, the core of their culture lived on in stories and secret rituals. Tales of great campaigns and endless herds were whispered around dimly burning winter fires. The memory of the summer of 1883 became a central element of their new folklore. It was a symbol of their shared pain and a reminder of who they had been in the past. They cherished this memory as the most precious treasure in their poor and limited world. The dawn of a new era was cold and unwelcoming, promising nothing but hard labor and humility. Yet they endured, preserving their identity even under the most unbearable conditions of the reservations. Their story became an example of incredible resilience in the face of global historical and natural disasters. The empty prairie remained forever in their hearts as a reminder of the cost of losing freedom. They learned to live in a new world without forgetting their great and glorious past. We have traced the most dramatic and quiet turning point in the history of the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. This story shows how the disappearance of a single element can lead to the collapse of an entire centuries-old civilization. The Lakota experience is a harsh lesson in the fragility of our world and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Please suggest topics in the comments for future videos that you'd like to see on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new explorations of forgotten pages of history.